as Mirko mentioned, when we first thought of how to do this presentation today, the first idea that we had was to do a presentation that is a normal one, in which I present the exhibition here. No? Feedback? In which I present the exhibition here to you and describe the whole the whole project. But then I realized that it's kind of strange to do that when the exhibition itself is 8 meters from here. So basically, if this is the plan of the building where we're at, our idea was to do like a 2-act presentation. And in the first part, I'll describe to you the background, the research, everything that led to the creation of the exhibition as it is right now. And in the second part, which would be perhaps less formal, those of you who might be interested might join me to the other room, see the things for yourselves, and criticize it as harshly as you like. I'm willing to take that if that's what it's going to be. So basically in this part, what I want to do is describe to you everything that is not in the other room. And the way I thought of structuring that is through 3 parts, or 3 moments in the life of this project, which, as Mirko mentioned, is going on in the CCA constellation for more than a year, but it's actually been going on before CCA. So the first chapter is BC, before CCA. And this thing was going on from around 2009 or 2010, where I basically developed this side project in parallel to my thesis project, which dealt with the American continental grid. Now, the American continental grid is basically this abstract system that was put in place in the 18th century, and the idea was that you could divide all of the territory in order to sell the land and, of course, sponsor governmental action. But to me, what was interesting in that system was the irregularities, or the places where it failed. As you can see some of them there, all of Texas that was out of the system, etc. So I began to look at certain historical documents, just collecting stuff, a lot of junk, but also some interesting stuff, to find where and how these irregularities happened. And then I came across one thing. I hope you can see that with these lights. And then I came across this photo, aerial photo. And once I realized this is not a photoshopped image, I realized this is a real area in the United States where you have what they call checkerboard forest. So this would be the Pacific Northwest. This specific image is taken from Montana. Each one of these squares is a square mile, so it conforms to the grid. And you have squares that are clear-cut and squares that are forests, right? So in a way, the grid in this instance is manifest in form, which for me was a very interesting condition, and of course I didn't know much about. So then I managed to get a small grant to go to this area of the United States. So what you see here is basically Washington State is on the left, Idaho here, Montana, Canada is a little bit up. All of these untitled place marks that you see are untitled place marks because the forests I visited have no names. So I just traveled there and I've seen a couple of these places, and I was basically struck by the industrial nature of this forest. So this was my first, perhaps, conclusion from this very small research, that these places don't look like what you would expect. These are not natural environments. These are completely artificial environments, even though they pretend to be nature. So they pretend to be trees. They're actually factories for wood production, okay? So this area of the world was kind of interesting in that sense. But I also came across the history that led to this checkerboard forest phenomenon that I showed you before. And this was basically a result of, a very strange history of land grants in the United States of the 19th century. So what happened basically in the 19th century, railroad companies got land from the federal government in order to sponsor their operations, because they had to cut the rail all the way to the west, which was a very expensive and very financially very risky operation. So the government gave them land. And the way the government gave them the land was in this checkerboard manner. So what you see here as colored, these colored things are basically all of the land that was given to basically private railroad companies. All of the white squares was left for the federal government, and the reason it was given in such a strange pattern was because the federal government didn't want them to have too much land in areas that were still not incorporated into states. So this was, like the wild, it's not the Wild West, but sort of wild areas, at least politically. So this is how it was given. And also the government was hoping to speculate on that. Once the rail was there, land values would rise and the government could sell its own land. So that's a very nice history, but what happened is that basically you got this pattern, right? So what you see here is that basically the railroad companies and later the private corporations to which they sold the land once railroad was not so lucrative or at least didn't produce revenue anymore, basically clear-cut their lands. So what you see here as clear-cut squares are private lands. What you see as forest squares are federally owned land. And what was striking to me here was the fact that this is no longer a visual pattern, but it also becomes an ecological pattern. Because basically, if you have these two squares, touching on the corners, animals or all forms of life cannot really move from one to the next. So it's a very fragmented pattern. And also because you have two different ownerships, private and public, you have to build double infrastructure, right? So you have to build federal road next to a private road, and this whole thing becomes a sort of ecological disaster. And if you know the history of this area, the Pacific Northwest, in the 60s and 70s, this exact pattern was the source of a huge environmental sort of struggle, at the end of which, the forestry corporations that own this land moved away from there. But to me, this idea that form is not only form, but it also has ecological implications, infrastructural implications, and all of these things have to do with forestry. And forestry as an idea of designing artificial environments was kind of interesting. But then I realized it was the case, ever since American forestry was born. So I came back to the library after spending some time in Montana, which was very nice. Went down to the basement, and then I found this one. And this one is basically the first, professional forest plan that was done in the United States by Gifford Pinchot. So Gifford Pinchot was, again, the first professional forester in America, and he designed that, if I can use this term, he designed this forest for the Vanderbilt estate in North Carolina. Vanderbilt was at the time, if you know, one of the richest people in the US, and he commissioned Olmsted to design his gardens for his mansion in North Carolina. And under Olmsted, Gifford Pinchot was given this land to experiment with and to show that forest could be profitable. So this was a sort of propaganda, and this map and working forest plan was later shown in the Columbian Exposition. So this is, again, first forest in the United States around 1893. Oops, sorry about that. Shouldn't touch my computer. But then, after doing some research, I realized this is not only a historical thing, but perhaps we could look at certain more contemporary design projects and think that, the relationship between forestry and design could work both ways. So it's not just that forestry is a form of design, but perhaps at certain moments you could think of certain projects as, influenced by the idea of forestry. So this would be one of them. This is the Weyerhaeuser company headquarters in Tacoma, designed by SOM San Francisco. The Weyerhaeuser company is one of the bigger or the largest forestry corporations in the world. And this is a very curious, it takes some time to understand it, but this is a very curious landscape plan, because what you see here as this white area, is basically forest. So in a way, it's an inverted plan. What you see as dark areas are the landscaped areas. All of these are forests. This strange thing is the building here. And when you look into the building, you see that this idea of how forestry works really influenced the way the typology of what you would imagine to be an international headquarters for a big company like Weyerhaeuser, how it is altered by these ideas, and how, just for one example, how the curtain wall is receding to the back to produce this very strange and nuanced relationship between the forest that is being cut outside to the landscaping that is going on inside. And the relationship between nature and sort of artificial operation becomes very blurry in this building. So with these two intuitions, I basically came to the CCA. The first intuition being that forestry is as a form of design, and the second that it's completely artificial. That what I'm interested in is a completely artificial enterprise. It's not about nature, right? So basically, when we came to the CCA, we were facing two processes when I began working here. The first was go through the collections of the CCA, which are immense, and there's a lot of stuff down here. And the second was to work with the exhibitions team and other people in the CCA to develop what you might call an approach, how to define the principles of turning this nice or not nice research project into an exhibition, which is a transformation that is not so simple, or at least it wasn't simple for me. So first, this idea of going through the collections. The first problem that I faced when I got here was that because of the way the collections at the CCA are organized, it's really hard to find something when you're looking for a topic like forests, okay? Because they're organized according to different things. It's basically an architecture collections. If my work would be, I don't know, looking for an architect like Le Corbusier or Cedric Price, my life would have been much easier perhaps. I mean, I don't know, but I imagine it to be. But what I basically had to do was go through everything, or at least everything I could find that relates to the topic. So I had to run, numerous searches in order to find what I was looking for, okay? So, after a while, we accumulated a lot of information and a lot of materials, right? So after a couple of months of working here, I basically had around 3,000 images that I was interested in, okay? That's because, perhaps, I'm interested in everything, but still, this was after going through some of the stuff that is down there. So, we were facing a big problem of how to narrow down 3,000 images or material, types of materials into, it's just a mathematical problem, how to reduce that into between 60 and 80 objects that you could put in the very small gallery that is next door. So this was the first problem, which is a very hard one, and we worked a lot on narrowing down, but it also helped us again to identify two things. First was key projects or key objects that we knew had something to do with how we wanted to frame the topic of this exhibition. So, things like that. At the beginning, I couldn't even explain to you why I was interested in that, but as we went along, things became more and more clear, and we became more aware of certain principles that we would like to structure our argument through. So the first one was that we deal with forestry and not forests. And while it might sound to you today very banal to say that, it took me like 6 months to get to this very simple conclusion. And when you talk about forestry, you really are talking about a form of knowledge that deals with the artificial creation of forest environments. Okay, so again, it's not about nature, it's not about the Amazon, it's not about sustainable development in the boreal forest. All of these things are very interesting to me, but it's not part of this project. But it also frames our interest historically, because forestry as a modern practice that deals with the management of forest lands develops at a certain point in time, which you could trace. Like, for instance, this is one of the earlier evidence of this practice by Duhamel de Monceau, which is something we found down here at the library. This is an Enlightenment thinker that deals a lot with forestry, also an interesting figure in general. But again, he deals with this idea of how to artificially structure forest systems. So this was the first thing, forestry, not forest. Second one was that we wanted to deal with historical materials in a contemporary way. So again, pretty early on, we got to the conclusion that we would like to look at things not in order to create a sort of historical timeline or narrative to describe the history of forestry, but really to frame projects and frame forestry issues from a contemporary standpoint. So for instance, again, this image, at the beginning we didn't know why we're interested in that. But after a while, this is from the Lausanne Expo, so this is Switzerland in the 1960s. After a while, it became clear to us that this model has a lot to do with the way forestry has been developing in this part of the world. So that was the second thing, sort of contemporary approach, if I may use that term. And the third one, which is also my favorite in a way, is really that we wanted to also consider projects that are not high architecture, and really look at all of the spectrum of projects in order to expand the discourse, expand what we were interested in by doing this exhibition. So for instance, this thing from the Osaka Expo, it's a very nice, I hope you think it's a very nice image. It's from the Osaka Expo in Japan in 1970, and this pavilion here, this thing, is the British Columbia Pavilion for basically the national pavilion of the province of British Columbia. And what is interesting about that is not only that it's made out of wood or anything like that, it's really about the modules of the forestry industry. So it really takes, it's not a romantic idea of the forest, it's not a romantic idea of trees, it's not architects who are inspired by, trees or something nice like that that I hate. It's really about thinking through forestry and producing some architectural statement. But it's also a very popular form of architecture, maybe not as popular as this thing, but still very popular in a sense that it's not included in the books of great architecture of the 20th century, but we wanted to keep that. And we thought it's important to keep that in order to open up the debate in a way on what are the boundaries of the architecture that we're interested in. So with these three principles, we got more or less to this point. And this point was more or less where I left, where I came out of the CCA, you could say. So we had more or less narrowed down what we were interested in, and we had our principles, but the conceptual structure was not yet in place. How to take all of these materials and build some sort of a narrative that makes sense to you guys when you go there. But basically, because we had our principles, we knew what we might be interested in. So then we were able to identify those things that were not inside the CCA. So this is outside the CCA. And once we identified them, we could go there and get them, or not go there, communicate with people and get there. And surprisingly, this became, I like this slide, it's kind of a super international project all of a sudden. So it looks like, OMA project map or something. But this basically is all of the places where we got the materials from. And the materials that we got there, I'll show you some of them in a second, really were used to complement our argument once we began to structure it. So things came in from Venice here, Switzerland, London, a couple of places in India, a couple of places in the United States, National Archives, Canada. We even have some stuff in Brazil. So in a way, this is just a stupid map, but it's also a map of the materials that we have, or at least some of them. This process also made me go through some tough bureaucratic moments in the archives of Venice, which I should share because it relates to the exhibition. So it took me 3 days to get 5 reproductions out, but in a way it was worthwhile because once we got the materials, we found the sort of prehistory of modern forestry in some of these, which you'll be able to see in the other room in more detail. Really a bureaucratic idea also of forestry that relates to perhaps to the bureaucratic struggle that I had to go there. But of course this is 500 years earlier. But really meticulous and very precise idea of how to manage forest lands in a very interesting way, I think. And we also found these amazing samples that were used to not map, but gain knowledge of the colonial territories. And these samples were being used as sort of messengers of botanical information that also had economic information. So what these things are used for. So thousands of these would travel between places like India, to the Kew Gardens in London, where we got this one. Or again, colonial India with these kind of amazing surveys from the middle of the 19th century that were not only nice drawings, or at least I think they're sort of nice, but also led to forest plans, the earliest forest plans that I know of, and nobody's seen them because they were buried in Harvard libraries for 100 years, and even the botany guys there were kind of, surprised when we found them. And this is also interesting for architecture and perhaps the history of architecture, I don't know. Because when you consider regional planning, it's a pretty early stage to have regional planning in the middle of the 19th century, and this is what they do in India with forests. And of course, contemporary projects such as this one, which is by Herzog de Meuron, this is just, as they took it after 5 months of us begging them to do that, they took it out of their archives, they took a photo and sent it to us so we see it exists. And this is a model of a very interesting project that basically deals with forests and architecture in the same way. So in a way, it's really striking and it's really interesting to our hypothesis here, because basically what they're saying is that we could design, it's all artificial, it's all planted or built, but we could design both settlement and a forest system under the same organizational principles as one thing. And this is a project from 1992 for the Hanover Expo, and it was never built. So again, once we had all of these materials, I'm showing you some of the back house of how the process worked. We started to structure them into groups and what would make sense, for visitors to walk in the galleries, what would work together, how to create a sequence. And of course, this was it was not always an easy process. It took a lot, because I was outside of here, it took a lot of correspondence, a lot of comments, sometimes to sort of absurd moments like that, where there are only comments and nothing else. This is probably my fault in this one. But basically, at the end of this, what we got to the point where we had basically the conceptual structure of how the exhibition works. So basically, I'll describe it to you very briefly. We have 4 groups of materials there that are shown on 4 areas in the space, and each one corresponds to a specific moment in time and also to a specific moment in the development of forestry. But also each one is containing a contemporary project. So the idea is that in each group, the contemporary project and the historical materials are reflecting on one another. So again, it's a historical way of showing history, if you want. Or maybe that's too complicated, but basically really including contemporary materials. So this first one, for each one, I would just say we chose what we call a category graphic. So each one has a type of document that represents its meaning, okay? So the first one is really this Venetian bureaucratic system that I was describing before, in which the Venetian Republic, so we're talking the 16th century more or less, developed this articulate bureaucratic system in order to control the supply of wood. And they needed to do that because they were relying on this supply in order to build their ships. Because if you know how shipbuilding works in the 16th century, it takes a lot of wood to build that, and it takes very specific wood of very specific qualities. So their response to this challenge to translate nature into resource was basically to create a bureaucracy. And the sort of expression of this bureaucracy is the list. They created thousands of these lists just to show where the forests are, who they belong to, how close they are to the rivers, how could you get them to the arsenale, which is the site, the big factory in which they built the ships back then. So that's the first one. Second one is what we call scientific forestry. And scientific forestry is represented here by a forest model. And the idea here is really that at a certain moment in 18th century in nation states like France, Germany, or Switzerland, certain thinkers like Enlightenment thinkers that I was mentioning before are starting to rationalize forest environments in order to understand how to manage them. So they apply scientific principles that developed then, mostly from botany, to really understand how the structure of the tree works, how the spacing between trees could work, and how these could become forest environments. And then they build models for that in order to project what would be the ideal forest in order to grow specific species of trees. So that's the second one. Third one is represented by the sample, and again, this is something I mentioned before. We call it tropical forestry, and tropical forestry, starting the 19th century, everything I told you about forestry before, which is developing in Europe, is suddenly confronted by this very strange context of, tropical context, and because of that, it needs to change, because the scale is so huge in places like India, because the forest environment itself just doesn't work according to nice, neat European principles. And I mean, I could explain the scientific side of it, but it's not interesting for this presentation. But basically, the type of document that is the register and the carrier of this correspondence, of this, transformation of forestry because of this tropical encounter is the sample. And again, these were sent back and forth. And last one is 20th century North America, really dependent on these experiments that I was mentioning in tropical context, both in terms of scale and in terms of the type of infrastructure and planning that's developed in places like India. North America is developing a brand of forestry, but of course, like all of these groups, it becomes immediately culturally specific, and it deals with profit. Okay, so in this sense, we're representing that by the business diagram. So forestry now, it's not about trees, it's about business diagrams. And this business diagrams is particularly nice because it shows you how land could become timber, could become logs, could become chips, as long as it ends with sufficient sales. That's the best thing always. So these are basically the four groups. And at the end, this is basically my last slide. So at the end, again, the background on this environment in which the forest really infiltrates the building. That is, again, the project I showed you before. I think the hypothesis of this exhibition is actually very simple. And this, to rephrase it basically, is that if forestry could be considered as design, perhaps certain design moments could be also considered through forestry. And if we could do that, maybe we could understand them better and expand our understanding of architecture and design. So that's it. Thank you.